Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready for another deep dive.
Always. What are we getting into today?
Well, you guys sent in this Discord chat log, and it is wild.
Oh,
Yeah, and to make things even more interesting, we've got a stack of articles, studies, reports, the whole shebang to help us break it all down.
sounds juicy. What's the main topic?
Basically, it's this whole debate about racial profiling, criminal justice stuff, and whether companies should be held responsible for the things they do, like ethically.
Big questions.
Huge. And things get super intense in this chat, I'm telling you.
Hmm.
The two main voices we're going to be hearing from are Toku and Jaggy, and let me tell you, they do not see eye to eye.
Opposing viewpoints make for the best deep dives. What are their stances?
Toku is all about, harsher punishments for criminals, way harsher. They even think drug traffickers should get the death penalty.
Wow, strong stance.
Right. And their reasoning is that these traffickers are profiting off of, suffering and destroying lives.
That's a perspective that aligns with act utilitarianism. It's judging actions based on their immediate consequences, trying to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. But it's not always so simple, as we'll see.
Okay, so then Jaggy jumps in and they're like, hold up. What about these giant corporations doing shady stuff?
Interesting. What kind of corporate practices are we talking about?
They bring up Nestle pushing baby formula instead of breastfeeding in developing countries where it can be really harmful.
Oh, I've heard about that, yeah.
And also Coca-Cola, their impact on the environment, water usage and all that.
So Jaggy is bringing corporate responsibility into the conversation, forcing us to think beyond street-level crime. They're saying that if we're going to talk about punishment, we can't just ignore the harm that powerful companies can cause, right?
Exactly. It's like, don't just point fingers at drug dealers when these big companies might be profiting from suffering on an even bigger scale.
That's a great point. I'm curious to hear how Toku responds to that.
Well, Toku doesn't really buy it. They claim there's, no comparison between drug traffickers and companies like Nestle, which they say just sells sugar.
That seems like an oversimplification.
Yeah, and Jaggy points that out right away. They're like, hello, the effects of all that sugar and all the other junk and processed food are far more widespread and damaging than the impact of, say, opioids. They even share some statistics about the global epidemics of obesity, heart disease, and diabetes linked to these kinds of foods. It's a pretty powerful counterargument. And Jaggy brings receipts. They start talking about Nestle paying doctors to promote their formula and Coca-Cola's environmental track record and all that.
This is where we start to see Toku's hypocrisy. They're very quick to condemn drug traffickers, but don't seem so concerned about the ethical implications of corporate actions, even when presented with evidence of harm.
Yeah, it's like they're applying totally different standards. And then things get even more heated when they start talking about racial profiling. Toku just straight up says that we need more police in Black and Latino neighborhoods because of higher crime rates.
Oh, wow. I'm assuming Jaggy and the others didn't let that slide.
Definitely not. Another participant, Ali Kitkat, jumps in and calls out the racist assumptions behind that whole line of thinking.
Good. It's crucial to address those kinds of statements directly. What did Ellie Kit Kat say?
Ali Kitkat talks about how people of color often face systemic disadvantages, especially if they're living in poverty, like being forced into low-income housing, going to schools that are underfunded, and just having, way fewer opportunities, all things that can push people towards crime.
That's such an important point. It highlights how crime rates don't exist in a vacuum. They're often tied to deeper societal problems. To focus solely on race ignores those complex factors.
Absolutely. And then Toku tries to use statistics about Asian financial success to argue that systemic racism doesn't even exist.
Ugh, the classic model minority myth, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's so dangerous and harmful because it just pits minorities against each other and completely ignores the struggles faced by tons of Asian Americans.
It's a way to dismiss the very real experiences of racism and discrimination faced by other groups.
And Jaggy and Ali Kitkat are not having it. They point out that not all Asians are rolling in dough, and a lot of successful Asian Americans are recent immigrants who came here with resources, which is a totally different situation than, Black Americans whose families have been dealing with generations of oppression and economic disadvantage stemming from slavery. It's just not a fair comparison.
That's a powerful rebuttal that exposes the danger of making generalizations about entire racial groups based on limited data. historical context is crucial, right? You can't just erase centuries of systemic racism and magically expect everyone to have equal opportunities just a few decades later.
Exactly. It's just not how the world works. And, speaking of this whole racial profiling thing, you sent over some research that really dives deeper into this issue.
Right, the profiling.txt source.
Yeah, that one. It's like full of studies showing huge racial disparities in how police treat people, even when you account for crime rates and stuff.
There's a really impactful quote in there from someone who talks about being followed by security in a store just for being Black. They talk about feeling humiliated and unworthy just because of their race.
Ugh, that's awful.
It really highlights the psychological toll that racial profiling takes, especially on people of color. That feeling of fear, distrust, and alienation from the very institutions that should be protecting them.
That breaks my heart, honestly. This isn't just some theoretical debate. It's about real people's lives.
Exactly. And tragically, those consequences can be deadly, as we know. The source also points out that Black Americans are killed by police at twice the rate of white Americans.
It's a terrifying reminder of how deeply ingrained these biases are and how fatal the consequences can be. And it's just impossible to ignore these issues, especially after all the protests and calls for police reform we've seen lately. It's bigger than just individual officers. It's about the systems and policies that allow these disparities to continue.
Absolutely. Which brings us to another crucial aspect of this conversation, the war on drugs. You sent over a source called waronDrugs.txt, which digs into how this so-called war has actually caused more harm than good, right?
Yeah, I was fascinated by this source. It explains how the war on drugs, with its crazy emphasis on punishment and zero tolerance policies, has actually ended up backfiring, especially when it comes to communities of color.
Think about policies like mandatory minimum sentences, drug testing for jobs and housing, and just the whole idea of criminalizing drug possession.
Right.
Those policies haven't really stopped drug use, but they have led to mass incarceration, which has disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities. And it's created all these barriers to essential services like housing, jobs, and even healthcare.
It's like trying to solve one problem by creating a whole bunch of new ones, right?
Exactly. And this circles back to what Jaggy was saying earlier about corporate crimes and how we hold companies accountable.
Right. They bring up McDonald's and Coca-Cola as prime examples of how companies can prioritize profits over ethical practices.
And you sent us those sources, mcd.txt and cola.txt, which lay out some pretty damning examples of their questionable practices. McDonald's, they're accused of not paying their employees fairly, tax evasion, and just basically having no regard for worker well-being.
And don't forget that quote from the former McDonald's CEO,
Yeah.
the one who said it's cheaper to buy a robot than to pay a living wage.
Chilling, right. It really shows how profit often comes before people in these corporate structures.
Totally. And Coca-Cola isn't off the hook either. There are accusations of environmental damage, union busting in Colombia, and even funding research to downplay how sugary drinks contribute to the obesity epidemic.
These examples really highlight the need for greater corporate accountability, especially when it comes to things like public health, the environment, and fair labor practices.
So given all of this, where does Toku stand on corporate responsibility?
Well, they double down on their support for the death penalty, specifically for drug traffickers.
But you sent over the deathpenalty.txt source, which really breaks down all the problems with capital punishment.
It really does. The source highlights how often innocent people are wrongly convicted and how many death sentences have been overturned because of legal errors. In Alabama alone, it's happened over 160 times.
That is terrifying. The thought of an innocent person being executed, it just makes the whole system seem so flawed.
The source poses this powerful question. Is the question not whether someone deserves to die for a crime, but whether society deserves to kill? It reframes the entire debate in a profound way.
It really makes you think, what are our values as a society if we're willing to take a life, even when there's a chance of getting it wrong?
It's a question that goes beyond the specific issue of drug trafficking and speaks to our fundamental beliefs about justice and the role of the state. It's heavy stuff.
It is. We've covered so much already. Racial profiling, corporate greed, the death penalty, the war on drugs. It's a lot to process.
It's true. But it's also amazing how these issues are all interconnected, stemming from larger societal problems like inequality, bias, and lack of accountability.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. The more we uncover, the more we realize how deep these problems go.
That's the nature of deep dives, isn't it? We keep digging until we get to the core of the issue.
We'll definitely need to take a break here to let all this sink in.
Agreed. It's been an intense but incredibly insightful conversation so far.
It really makes you think.
Absolutely. It's challenged us to examine our own beliefs and confront some uncomfortable truths about the systems we live in.
I know I've had to question some of my own assumptions. And I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface. There's still so much more to unpack, but we'll save that for part 2.
Looking forward to it.
Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back to continue this deep dive soon.
It really is a lot to take in, isn't it? But that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating, you know? We get to really immerse ourselves in these complex topics and explore them from all these different angles.
Totally. It's like putting together a giant puzzle where each source is another piece, helping us see the bigger picture. But the thing is, sometimes it feels like the more pieces we find, the more we realize just how much we don't know.
Well, I think that's the sign of a curious mind, right? It's not about having all the answers, but about embracing the questions, being open to new information, and really enjoying that journey of discovery.
So true. And, going back to something Jaggy said earlier in the chat, that whole idea of how focusing only on street-level crime while ignoring the messed up things corporations do
Yeah.
is like this weird selective morality really stuck with me.
It's a brilliant observation. It makes us re-examine our own biases, like who are we holding accountable and who are we letting off the hook? What even counts as harm, right?
Exactly. It's almost like we have this unspoken hierarchy of harm, where some crimes are seen as way worse than others, even when they cause just as much suffering. And it often feels like the people at the top, those with the most power and wealth, are judged by a totally different set of rules.
That is a crucial point. When we talk about criminal justice, it's impossible to ignore those power dynamics. Who gets to decide what's a crime? Who benefits from the current system? And who gets hurt the most by it? These are all questions we need to be asking.
For sure. And this brings us back to that profiling.txt source you sent over, the one with all the research about how racial bias influences how people are treated by the police, even when you consider things like crime rates.
Right, because the evidence is overwhelming at this point. People of color, especially Black and brown individuals, they're just more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested, even for minor things. And as we talked about before, those encounters can turn deadly.
Reading that personal account from someone who talked about being followed around a store just because of their race, feeling humiliated and unworthy, it was just heartbreaking. It's a reminder that these aren't just numbers in a study. These are real people's lives and experiences.
Absolutely. It's a form of psychological violence, really. It erodes trust, it creates fear, and it just reinforces those existing power imbalances.
And that constant sense of being targeted, being seen as suspicious simply because of your skin color. It can have these ripple effects throughout a person's life.
Without a doubt, it can impact everything from educational opportunities and job prospects to things like housing and healthcare. It traps people in this cycle of disadvantage that is incredibly hard to escape.
So how do we even begin to dismantle these harmful systems? How do we move towards a society that is actually just and equitable for everyone?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a complex problem that demands a complex solution. We have to start with addressing the root causes of these inequalities, things like poverty, unequal access to quality education, and of course, systemic racism.
And we can't just slap on a Band-Aid, right? We have to hold people in positions of power accountable, whether they're in government, in law enforcement, or running big corporations.
I completely agree. Transparency, accountability, and a genuine commitment to social justice are essential. We need to shift our focus from just punishing people to actually preventing these harms in the first place. We have to stop focusing on just blaming individuals and start looking at these systemic solutions.
That's a big ask, but I think it's the only way forward if we truly want a world where everyone has the chance to thrive, regardless of their race, background, or how much money they have.
I couldn't agree more. And this loops back to Jaggy's point about corporations needing to be held responsible for their actions, too. If we're serious about addressing all the harms happening in our world, we just can't keep ignoring the things big companies do when they prioritize profits over people and the planet.
When I first started reading this Discord chat, I was kind of on the fence about Jaggy comparing things like drug trafficking to how corporations operate. Part of me thought it was like deflecting from the idea of individual responsibility.
I can understand that initial reaction. It's easy to get stuck in those silos, thinking about these problems in isolation. But what Jaggy is doing is actually really important. They're challenging us to broaden our understanding of harm. They're asking us to look at the bigger picture, the bigger context of all these issues.
And the more I think about it, the more I see that they have a really valid point.
Mhm.
We can't just focus on one type of crime while pretending these corporations that have so much power and influence aren't causing just as much or even more damage in the world.
Exactly. And those sources you sent us about McDonald's and Coca-Cola really drive that point home, don't they?
Totally. McDonald's with their alleged wage theft and just exploiting their workers, and Coca-Cola with their history of environmental damage and union busting in Colombia, these are not small potatoes.
Not at all. And when you factor in that quote from the former McDonald's CEO about how it's cheaper to buy a robot than pay a living wage, it exposes a disturbing corporate mindset.
Yeah, like profits are more important than the well-being of their employees, right?
Yeah.
And when companies operate with that kind of bottom line mentality, it has consequences for all of us.
For sure. It leads to greater income inequality, weakens the middle class, and just undermines the very fabric of our communities. And when people are struggling just to survive, it can lead to desperation, and in some cases, criminal activity.
So it's all connected, right?
Hmm.
The actions of these corporations, the policies our government puts in place, the biases embedded in our legal system, it all feeds into this cycle of harm that disproportionately impacts marginalized communities.
Precisely. It's this complex web of interconnected systems and power dynamics. And if we want to create real, meaningful change, we have to tackle these issues at their core.
It's like we need to treat the disease, not just the symptoms.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, how much do our individual choices actually contribute to these systems and these narratives that perpetuate so much harm? Sometimes it can feel overwhelming, like whatever we do is just a drop in the ocean.
I hear that.
But even though systemic change requires collective action, that doesn't mean our individual choices are meaningless. We can start by looking inward, examining our own biases, and challenging those harmful narratives that we've internalized over the years.
Like that whole model minority myth that Toku is using to justify their views.
Yes, exactly. We have to be more critical about the information we consume, questioning the stories we're told, and actively seeking out diverse perspectives.
I think we also need to find the courage to speak up when we see injustice, even when it feels uncomfortable or risky.
I wholeheartedly agree. Silence often equals complicity. We all have a responsibility to use our voices to advocate for change, support organizations fighting for social justice, and hold those in power accountable for their actions.
It's about realizing that each of us has power, even if it feels small, and using that power to create a ripple effect that can lead to positive change.
Well said. And remember, change rarely happens overnight. It's a long and winding road, but every step we take in the right direction brings us closer to a more just and equitable society.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation, but my
Yeah.
brain is definitely feeling a bit overloaded right now.
I hear you. We've covered some pretty heavy topics today, from racial profiling to corporate greed, from the death penalty to the war on drugs. It's a lot to unpack.
It's been an intellectual roller coaster, but even though it's been challenging, I feel like we've gained such a deeper understanding of these issues and how they all connect to each other.
That's the beauty of deep dives, right? We get to explore complex topics, challenge our assumptions, and come away with a more nuanced perspective. But before we get too bogged down in all the heavy stuff, can we take a moment to appreciate Jaggy's sense of humor in all of this?
Oh, for sure. Their snarky comebacks and clever analogies definitely made this chat a lot more entertaining. I love that part where they compared Toku's arguments to a Swiss cheese argument full of holes.
Brilliant. And it also highlights a really important point. Humor can be a powerful tool for challenging harmful narratives and exposing hypocrisy.
Like they say, laughter is the best medicine. Even when we're dealing with serious issues, it can help us stay grounded, connect with each other, and even find moments of joy in the midst of all the heaviness.
I couldn't agree more. Laughter can build bridges, disarm defensiveness, and make us more receptive to new ideas and possibilities.
So well said. And on that note, I think we're ready to take a deep breath and dive into the final leg of our journey.
I'm eager to see where this conversation takes us next.
Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back to wrap up this fascinating deep dive. All right, deep divers, we're back. Ready for the final stretch of this wild ride through the world of criminal justice, corporate accountability, and, just some really intense online debate drama.
It really has been quite a journey, hasn't it? From ACT utilitarianism and the war on drugs to racial profiling and the model minority myth, all sparked by a single Discord conversation.
I know, right? It's crazy how these online debates can spiral out of control and then lead to such a deep exploration of all these big, complex, interconnected issues.
I think it speaks to how much these conversations matter, even when they get a little heated. They force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, Examine our own biases and really wrestle with how complicated the world is.
Definitely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, that quote from the deathpenalty.txt source keeps popping into my head. The one that asks, is the question not whether someone deserves to die for a crime, but whether society deserves to kill?
Such a powerful question, right?
It really gets to the heart of the ethical dilemma around capital punishment, I think.
Yeah.
Like, it forces us to confront our own beliefs about justice, retribution, and what role the government should even play in all of this.
It's so easy to get swept up in the emotional side of it all, especially when we're talking about really horrific crimes.
Right.
But that quote, it reminds us to step back and consider the bigger picture. The fact that the system makes mistakes, the terrifying possibility of executing an innocent person, and the fundamental question of whether we as a society should have the power to take a life.
It makes you question everything. And those questions, they don't just apply to the death penalty.
Yeah,
They make us look at the entire criminal justice system differently.
I agree.
Are we really seeking justice?
Yeah.
Or are we just trapped in this cycle of punishment and revenge that mostly hurts marginalized communities?
Right, and it makes you wonder if maybe we're focusing on the wrong things. What if, instead of spending all this money on prisons and punishment, we actually tried to address the root causes of crime?
Like what?
Like poverty, lack of opportunities, education, tackling those systemic problems head on.
And what about racism?
Exactly.
Yeah.
What if our focus shifted from blaming individuals to creating actual systemic solutions, from wanting revenge to wanting rehabilitation and healing?
It does feel like we're at this crossroads, after everything we've uncovered in this deep dive, the flaws in the system, the horrors of racial profiling, the urgent need for corporate accountability. Where do we even go from here? What can we actually do to build a society that is more just and fair for everyone?
Well, I think the first step is awareness. We have to educate ourselves about these issues, challenge our own biases, and be willing to have those tough conversations even when they're uncomfortable.
So it's not enough to just sit here and talk about it. We have to actually do something.
We all have to be active participants in this process of change, not just passive observers.
Okay, so what can we actually do?
We can support those organizations that are on the ground fighting for criminal justice reform. We can advocate for policies that address these systemic inequalities, and we can hold our elected officials accountable for their decisions.
And what about in our own lives? Like day to day, what can we do?
We can choose to support businesses that are ethical, we can speak up when we see injustice happening, and we can refuse to be complicit in these systems that perpetuate harm.
It's about recognizing that we all have a part to play in building a more just and compassionate world. And it's also about understanding that this is going to take time.
Absolutely.
It's not a quick fix. It's going to be a long road. But the more we work together, the more change we can create.
I think so too.
Wow, this has been quite a journey. I mean, we started with this random Discord debate and ended up diving deep into these huge questions about criminal justice, corporate responsibility, and what justice even means.
It really has been a wild ride, and it's been an honor to explore these topics with you and all our listeners. And while we might not have all the answers, I truly hope that this deep dive has inspired everyone to keep asking those tough questions, to keep challenging assumptions, and to never give up on building a more just and equitable future.
So well said. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.